Hello, I'm Royal Orr, and welcome to our special Epiphany series kicking off the centennial year for the United Church of Canada. We're going to be talking with a whole range of great people over the next 8 weeks, and we hope you're going to be joining us both to hear those conversations, but hopefully to have your own conversations as congregations or as people of faith who have gathered to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the United Church. We're kicking off with a very special guest, the very Reverend Richard Bott, 43rd moderator of the United Church. He's with us to start things off. He's also minister of Grace United Church in Burlington, as well as the chair of the United Church of Canada Centennial Committee. Hello, Richard.
Hello, Royal. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks very much for joining us. So let's start with the obvious. What's planned for the centennial of the United Church?
Well, it's really interesting because while there are national events that are being planned, like the celebration that's going to be happening, I believe, on June 8th, a worship service that is going to be hosted by the National Church and be able to be shared across the church, there are a lot of things happening within regions and within local communities of faith. And what excites me even more is within groupings of communities of faith that are getting together. So there are lots of different things that are happening.
Yeah, I've already heard about some massed choir events. For example, in New Brunswick, I've heard about that being coming together. So how does this fit into the life of the church? Obviously, it's a celebration, but it's a look back, I'm sure, for many communities of faith. But I'm assuming you're also encouraging people to look ahead as well.
Absolutely. Part of the reality of any time of anniversary in our life, I believe it really needs to be both celebration and commemoration and that sense of looking forward. We take a look back at our past to learn from it, to recognize those places that we probably haven't lived the gospel the way we wanted to also recognize those times when God spoke through the people united in amazing kinds of ways, to take a look at those and to celebrate what our spiritual ancestors have done, what our grandparents have done, what our parents have done, and what we've done, but also take all of those things and go, so what now? Where is God drawing us into the next thing in the United Church? Or being the United Church. One of the things about the sort of focused theme, the fact that it's taking on that idea of deep spirituality and bold discipleship and daring justice, is that it really does encompass much of our ministry. And it's not just looking to our past, it's not just what we do right now, it's really looking into, so who are we going to be in the next 100 years?
So that's what keeps us from falling into just nostalgia, right? I mean, that sense of challenging ourselves to think about what's coming.
Absolutely. And I want to say nostalgia can be a good place to dip into. I mean that to hear the stories again of what things happened, to be able to kind of take those stories out of the walls and make them live again, I think can be an absolutely wonderful spark for us. I think we got to be careful not to get in that space where, well, I remember when the walls were bursting and the Sunday school had thousands of kids, and it's too bad that it's not like that now. Like, we have to be careful not to get into that space, but to be able to celebrate what that's meant for us. And what could that look like now? What could that mean now? Maybe our walls aren't bursting, but maybe we're going really deep with our children and with our teens and with adults into what it means to be disciples of Jesus in the 21st century.
Okay, and that framework you've given for us, which is a challenging and interesting one of like, remembering, but also imagining. For you personally, I mean, you obviously have a very, very deep knowledge of the United Church of Canada. For you personally, what are you remembering and what are you imagining?
When I think about remembering, I think about St. John's United Church on the North Shore of Lake Superior in a small town called Marathon. And being a child who raced on the linoleum tile underneath the pews with my brother on either side of the church to see who could worm their way to the front of the church. I remember the ministers who sat with us on the front stairs and who told us stories and had us rap. that. I remember Christmas times where we would sing Christmas carols at the church, and then we would go and join other communities of faith, the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics and the Baptists. And then after Christmas Eve service, we would go up to the hospital and we would join together in singing. So I'm remembering those things that are personal to who I am, but I'm also remembering being a teenager in Sudbury at General Council when we walked down the hill, and the moderator presented the apology to the indigenous communities. Sorry, I'm finding I'm tearing up. I'm remembering 1988 and being at General Council and making a decision around what it meant for to be able to be ministers in the United Church, and that sexual orientation in and of itself would not be a barrier to being ordained or commissioned in the United Church of Canada. I'm remembering all of those moments that are personal to who I am, but have been also moments for us as a church that have moved us into the next place in our life.
And that next place, I'm going to ask you to imagine.
Well, it's interesting because um, during COVID, uh, during the time of the pandemic, when I watched communities of faith come together in ways that none of them had ever expected, where people had to learn really quickly how to use technology like this, or where we reached back into old technology and people started writing letters and dropping them off at people's places so that the connection continued to happen, where we had communities of faith deciding we're going to deliver meals to the people who are single in the congregation because they're not getting contact. I watched the United Church of Canada find new ways of being the people that we are. And so when I take a look now and I see that there are communities of faith that are in that place of not being sure where God's calling us next, of being afraid that we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we may not be able to be the community of faith that we've been. One of the things that I am absolutely certain of is that the message of the gospel and the way that the United Church has lived that and has continued to live that is going to continue whether or not those communities of faith are able to be communities of faith, because being United Church disciples is deep inside of who we are. Now, alongside of that, I'm also watching communities of faith that are finding an increase in folks who are coming to participate with them. And so there are some folks who are in that space of needing to let go and needing to find new ways of being United Church disciples. And there are others who are finding communities of faith that are growing. So I really believe that we are going to find new ways of being the United Church of Canada. I believe that one of the things that this Centennial can do is help us to not be as much just Grace United Church or St. John's United Church or Port Nelson United Church or Spirit Alive United Church, but to be United Church, to be people who are together as community of faith. And I believe that when we're celebrating like this, we find ways of lowering some of those barriers that keep us from being the people that we are. So I believe that the Centennial can be one of those moments that truly helps us to be who we're going to become.
That's beautiful stuff. But I'm going to circle back now to the practical side of things and just how is this? I mean, again, I'm sure it's still coming together to a certain extent, but how's this all going to be structured? How is there a place where people can go and figure out what's going on? Maybe do some of that reaching out, which you're talking about, which is exciting and promising. So, how is this being structured?
So in lots of ways, it's really organic. There are some things that are being named by, say, the General Council office, and I like the service that kind of started our Centennial year and the service that will finish our Centennial year. I know that the moderator is doing talks and bringing other people in with her flourishing events that I think have some connection to this Centennial celebration. So there are formal things like that, but what we're seeing is that really there's the organic growth of celebrations and commemorations coming out of congregations. So we've got things like, I'll give my own. Grace United Church in Burlington is doing 100 days of prayer for 100 years united, and are inviting ministers and worship leaders from across the church to write prayers. And then we're going to share those across the church so that we can be a praying community for every day for the 100 years that are coming up. And there are communities of faith that are planning potlucks and building natural rain gardens to celebrate. So there's so many things. One of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to capture all of those on the Centennial page of the United Church's website. There's a place, a link, I believe, right on the bottom of the website. I think I'd have to go back and check, but there's a link there where any community of faith or group of communities of faith can link. They can put in what their event is, when their event is happening, and they can put in, they can actually put a pin on the map so we can actually see across the entire church where's the celebration happening, how are we doing these things, and we can learn from each other about what's happening in different communities of faith. I have heard of one church that's decided to go and find every cookbook that was made by the UCW over 100 years and choose at least one recipe from each one of them. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the 1940 and 1950 cookbooks were like.
Listen, Richard, it's just a great pleasure to speak with you, and I hope we get a chance to talk again. But if not, have a great 2025 and a deep and moving and fulfilling celebration of our 100th anniversary. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Royal.
Well, turning now to sort of how this centennial, and we've already touched on it already, but how it's sort of affecting the wider church and the future of the church. Joining me to talk a little bit about that is Cheryl-Ann Stadlebauer-Sampa. She's the Senior Governance Support Lead at the General Council Office. Cheryl-Ann, hello.
Hello, Royal.
So our national strategic plan is well launched, right? I mean, we're into it already. And so could you maybe start just by talking a little bit about how the centennial celebration nests into that strategic plan?
Well, I'd be pleased to do that. Thank you for asking. The Centennial celebration falls within the section called Strengthening Invitation. So our strategic plan is a focused effort to help us grow into the church we seek to be. And that is a church with connected, evolving, diverse communities of faith. So the Centennial celebration has within it different streams that help make that possible. And one of those streams is the internal stream, which is very much what Richard highlighted in what he was sharing. What are the plans we have within communities of faith that lift up our heritage, that celebrate our identity, that recognize our failings, but yet invite us to see that we have a ministry to continue as the United Church of Canada. But another element of that stream is a public-facing campaign that will be launched this coming year that will invite people to become reacquainted with the United Church if they have left it, or invite people who don't know us to discover how we are unique and what our strengths and characteristics are. So the Centennial is this broad way of doing these two pieces, inside and to the world outside of the church. So we're not just talking to ourselves, but that we're issuing an invitation, come and see, come and meet us, come and know about us, come discover who we are. And hopefully in the process, you will find a place that meets your needs, deepens your faith, encourages you to grow in your understanding of the gospel and the role you play in bringing it to life.
So this is United Church evangelism for 2025. Is that what
Very much so. And for sure, under our Strengthen Invitation initiative in the strategic plan. And I do want to say our strategic plan is thanks in great part to Reverend Richard and his role when he was moderator. He was key in that, has also our General Secretary, Michael Blair, and Jennifer Henry, our Executive Minister, Organizational Development and Strategy. They're the key leads on it, but as with all General Council staff, we are a part of it. And it's exciting to be a part of it. It's exciting to have our work focused, to have a clear goal and intention, to be articulating outcomes that we hope will happen, such as the outcome of 100 new communities of faith,
Yeah,
which people found ambitious for sure.
well, I want to talk about that in a moment, but before we get to that, this series, and indeed a lot of people's thinking about the Centennial, has been inspired to a certain extent by the work of Brian Arthur Brown, who we're going to be speaking to in a few minutes, and some of his writing over the last few years, specifically his books, The Keys to the Kingdom and The Untied Church of Canada. In The Untied Church of Canada, that I think many people are using and some congregations are using to focus their discussions about the Centennial, he characterizes the church now as, I'm gonna make sure I get this right, lean, green, and keen. And I'm just wondering, do you think that's a good characterization of where we are as a church right now?
That the chapter in which he does that was actually my favorite chapter in the book. And what I loved about it is I think that that chapter, like the strategic plan, takes the hope we have, which Richard articulated well. Our hope as the people of God, who we are, the expression to the gospel that we give as United Church people. And then it couples it with optimism, which we distinguish the two, right? Our hope is from God. Optimism is about the outcomes. And what the strategic plan does, and what Brian highlighted in that first chapter, is what are the steps we could take that the key and vibrant message of the way in which the United Church shares the gospel will continue and thrive and touch more lives and impact our world. And that's something that I think the strategic plan and chapter 1 of Brian's book, The Untied Church of Canada, captured together. You know, in that chapter, Brian looks at how we made the decision to restructure. And that has consumed a lot of time of us talking about who we are and how we'll be together. But he notes wisely in that we were spending almost all our energy just on meetings about meetings. I think that's a phrase Brian has in the book. And the goal of restructuring was to say, how do we spend less time talking about being the church and actually being the church? And as we move into the evaluation of restructuring, I hope that's one of the intangibles we can try to capture. What are people doing with the time they now have that they previously dedicated to very demanding presbytery roles or conference roles or meetings that they can now expend in local ministry? So part of it is that's the lean part of it, but I also think what the strategic plan does is it invites us now to stop just talking about how are we together into what do we do when we're together to be the people God has invited us to be. And for sure, the strategic plan with its 6 objectives invites us into that and has a focus on the health and well-being of communities of faith at its core.
Okay, so I just want to talk about this restructuring just a little bit before we get onto the growth agenda and some of the other challenges that we've set for ourselves. You know, I'm active a little bit with the NIagara Regional Council, which covers most of Quebec, as you know. And like watching it, I'm not like deeply involved with them, but watching it, I get the sense maybe I'm being more hopeful than optimistic, but I get the sense that these structures are starting to find their footing, right? They're like, it's taken a while to figure it out. It's taken a while to get over losing conference structures, which were a little bit more worshipful, I think, than the transactional work of the old presbyteries. And it's taken a while to get there, but I think I see evidence that maybe we're figuring that one out a little bit as well. From your perspective, watching these things and evaluating what's going on, what's happening with these new structures?
So I think you've captured it well. It is important to remember. It is important to remember that we had a pandemic shortly after we shifted to our new structures. And I think that that the church as a whole has confused some of the consequences with the pandemic with restructuring. So we do hear that people feel isolated. And what is clear to me is that regional councils in general offer many opportunities for people to connect. There isn't an enormous uptake to connect for the sake of connection. And I think we need to help focus how we engage people across regional councils to connect so that that now can have an educational and equipping endeavor. Previously, it was about business. It was about work. You have motions to make and decisions. I think now there's this wonderful opportunity to say, how are we equipping our leaders to address change? How are we equipping our leaders to be evangelists? Because I can only speak for my own generation, but that was not something that I learned how to do either as a United Church member or a United Church minister. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity there for our regional councils to provide that. I would say I am a bit worried that we have a bit of a default to congregationalism. And I loved Richard's image of how do we bring people together so we have this broader identity. I worry a bit about that because it seems without the structure forcing people to connect, that they connect only when they're obligated by a decision they need made. So helping people to rediscover connection in the strong Methodist sense of a common purpose, a common identity, a common goal. I do believe that congregationalism is a luxury that will be the death of the church, and that we need to figure out how to be partners in the broader ministry that's entrusted to the United Church.
If I could ride a personal horse here, congregationalism and clericalism.
Yes, definitely.
Both things that our future cannot afford.
No.
Anyway, but COVID, can we talk about COVID a little bit more as well? Because clearly that sent every institution and organization in the world into a bit of a tailspin for a while. And I guess a couple of things about COVID. What's your sense about the extent to which we have recovered? And specifically, to what extent have people come back, not just in terms of their participation, but in terms of their financial support for the churches, whether it's congregational or national?
So I think COVID has forever changed that. And I suspect that congregations that are waiting for some sort of return to 2019 will die on the doorstep of waiting. And that congregations have embraced the world as different, and we need to reach out to people in different ways, and we need to be clear about our ministry and their place in it, will do better. I don't see, I think COVID disrupted patterns that people have not reclaimed. Although those patterns were already being changed. I have quite a gap between my two older children and my youngest. And what I like to tell people is when my older children went to Sunday school, regular church attendance were the children who came 3 Sundays out of 4. By the time my youngest went to Sunday school, about 12 to 15 years later, regular church attendance were the children who came 1 out of 4. Like it had completely flipped. And I think that trend was well underway and COVID just exacerbated it.
Yeah.
But what I do think is that COVID has also illustrated to us the dangers of isolation and the pandemic of loneliness and the mental health issues that grow out of that. And the need for connection and community has never been sharper. We as a church have an opportunity to respond to that. We have an opportunity to be evangelists. We have good news for that. So how can we share that good news in a way that touches lives and invites people to belong to the community, not just to attend on the Sunday?
Yeah, okay. But even attend on Sunday, I've spoken to ministers and senior lay leaders in congregations, and they're very proud about how many people patch into their Zoom the Zoom version of their services, right? And I'm a little bit suspicious about how much pride we should take in that. Not to say that that's not a real connection potentially, but it's like maybe it's just as me, old United Church person, unable to move with the times. But I'm not getting the sense that there's real connection. I'm not getting a sense that it's turning into money in the finances of the local congregation or the community of faith. And so I'm just wondering if we're fooling ourselves about this, and how do we look at it? Is it transition to something new? What do you see there?
So it's another one of those places where I don't think we're very well equipped because, in addition to not talking about evangelism often, we don't talk about money very well in the United Church,
Yeah.
which is another point that Brian brings up in his book. And I've attended many online services where the opportunity to donate was never even voiced or lifted up. And so you're right. I think like it's important for us to recognize and is that belonging to a community is different from consuming a service. And how we transform Zoom so that it becomes a belonging to a community is something we're still learning to do. I have been part of a congregation that I thought did that well, but they did it in a couple of very clear ways. They did it with kind of online chat time as people joined with the in-person community. They did it by having it all at the same time. It wasn't kind of a videotape here, shared there. I mean, they worked at it. I don't know that it was perfect, but the questions about how are we a community and not just consuming a service. And it's something that's always bothered me about church shopping. You do have to find a church home where you can grow, but church shopping suggests you are looking for the best deal or the elite model or the whatever. And I think, we aren't consuming something when we attend church. We are engaging in a community to which we belong.
That's very wise. I could talk to you all day, but my time is limited. So I do want to touch on quickly at the end the growth agenda, because you're right. That was something that really stood out for many people who looked at the strategic plan. Where are we with the growth agenda right now, Cheryl-Ann?
Well, we are making progress, and I wish I had the exact numbers. I should have looked them up for you, so my apologies that I didn't do that. We do have new communities of faith forming, and many of them are communities that are not as typical as former communities. So some of them are new immigrant communities who are moving into the United Church, coming from other places around the globe with strong Methodist heritage, building on our Methodist connection. Um, we have some new Francophone communities. I think for sure we have some growth in that. What's most important, though, at least from my perspective, is that growth not be about how many new communities we make, although that's a good way to measure outcomes, but that it be about how skilled are we becoming at strengthening the invitation. All of us, well, I can't speak. Let me speak for myself. This is something I have been backwards to do, even in my own family, who were all raised United Church, are mostly lapsed. And it's how do we spark conversations? So that includes with my own children who would say they have faith, but they don't have church connection. So I started off with some Centennial merchandise this year as part of their Christmas bounty, and then sparked a conversation. But I'm a little worried about your spiritual life. Can we talk? And mostly they rolled their eyes and dismissed me, but at least we got it on the table.
Yeah.
And that's the piece I need to learn to do better. The next chapter in my own personal growth is how do I talk about my faith to others in a way that doesn't impose it, but that opens the invitation to be part of a church that has been inspirational and transformational in my life. I would not be who I am today if I was not formed in the United Church and nurtured by the United Church. So I have a great love for the denomination and all the opportunities it's given me and the challenges it's offered me to expand my thinking and how I engage the world.
Want to hold that up for everybody to hear. Maybe we'll repeat it even a little bit later in this, in this little production. But Cheryl-Ann, thank you. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you today. We really appreciate you taking the time. So anchoring this series is, I mentioned him already, is Brian Arthur Brown, perhaps best known to many in the church for his recent books, Keys to the Kingdom and the Untied Church of Canada, both published by Woodlake Publications, but also really the producer of this series. So Brian, it's great to speak with you today, and I'm just going to kind of hand this over to you to bring this first episode of our Epiphany series to a close.
Sure. And I thank you very much, Royal. You apologized about the time, that we only have limited, and we've told people this will be a half hour, but it's being recorded on YouTube, and if it goes 3/4 of an hour, nobody's going to be unhappy. We're a little over the half hour now, and we're fine. The Untied Church of Canada, I still get letters, emails telling me that, do you know the publisher misspelled the title? But the Untied Church suggests that we are untied from some of the things that have been holding us back. And in the ways that Cheryl-Ann has described, we are ready to go ahead. The most exciting thing that I have seen lately is a couple of weeks ago, 100 United Church Black Francophone youth in their rally at the United Church in Sherbrooke, which is a great old United Church, but the English people have disappeared for the most part, moved to Ontario or whatever, in Sherbrooke, Quebec. And the congregation, the choir is black. It's French speaking. It's mostly African immigration. People who dragging their suitcases across the border near there are now working in the hospital in Sherbrooke and are attending the United Church. And who even a year ago could have guessed 100 youth Black Francophone meeting in rural Quebec? So yes, some great things are happening. I'm very much aware of the bits of decline and things of that nature, but over the course of the whole church history, you hear about revivals and renewals, and you know the only reason that you hear about them is that there had been declines. And the church does have some of this over the centuries. We see it in Europe, we see it in America, and we see it in Canada. So this series was originally planned by Woodlake as a Lenten series, just a little bit before the June activities to kind of push us forward in a way. We were persuaded by Cheryl-Ann that we should switch to the period of Epiphany, partly because the United Church Publishing House has had a Lenten series, and they weren't going to give it up to Woodlake. So that's fine. We don't want to be in competition. But after hearing people speak today, I'm almost glad it began now. The Epiphany series will probably not attract as much attention as it might have if it had been in Lent. And so we have some regrets about that. But regardless of the number of people participating, if it is even on 8 evenings, the panelists themselves speaking to each other and the other panelists that are coming up or have been on before, we will be involved. We are among those who are going to be very involved in June, and so even at that. But I know that there are individuals, and I know that there are a good number of congregations all across the country that are watching this evening, and so I should say a special welcome to Zion congregation in New Hamburg, whose church secretary managed to get the dope on how to connect just at the last minute and so on. And so we're glad for that. And I also heard yesterday that we're being watched this evening by not only members of the Chinese United Church in Toronto, but a whole host of new young adult Chinese immigrants who are considering joining the United Church. So these are the things that I have been anxious to emphasize. I've been accused of some of not being willing to acknowledge the decline, and that we should be spending more effort helping congregations to close gracefully, and so on. All right, we do all of that, but I think it's also important that we look forward to what's worth celebrating in the future as we look at our past as well. So I know that we have a great national service coming up on the 8th of June. It will be live streamed from Gower Street Church in Newfoundland. And there will be some regional things, although many regions are simply going to be celebrating a little bit at their annual meeting, which is usually in May, and so on. But there is something about the congregational celebrations that Richard touched on, suggesting that there's something organic going on as well. In 1925, I'm sorry to say, in the 25th anniversary of the church, there was apparently not much mention. 25 years wasn't seen as a big deal. In the 50th anniversary, there were a few books written. One book in particular by Grace Lane, Brief Halt at Mile 50. But it was mentioned at General Council that year, and it was mentioned at Presbytery, and it was mentioned at conference, but no other big deal. And the 75th anniversary, much the same. Nothing much planned for congregations. Congregations, we were hoping to find 75 congregations who could ring their church bells for the 75th anniversary. They didn't find 75, so they gave that up. And there was really nothing much planned for congregations. This time, there's something going on in the congregations. I think they'll all be having a service, but right along with what Richard was saying, the clustering, the coming together. Woodlake, before it had its own demise, had organized about 50 such clusters, and they are going forward. But now we feel there are probably 100 clusters. I'm with a group that we sort of call Friends of the Foundation that is organizing some things, and our secretary, Jan White, is on the phone and on the email with all kinds of congregations that are wanting to cluster. And so we think we have at this point about 100 clusters across the country. And these are anywhere from 8 or 10 congregations in the largest big sanctuary nearby, 8 or 10, or there are some clusters that are well organized already and have had joint choir practices already, with as many as 22 congregations in a cluster. And so I think this anniversary 100th is going to be congregational led, not denying or diminishing the importance of the national or regional aspects. And I'm also concerned about congregationalism, except that we are hopeful that in the anniversary year, congregations may derive strength from each other and encouragement from each other, and that congregations going forward are going to grow and become strong. We're going to find ways to remain conciliar and make that meaningful. But something that's happening in this anniversary is the coming together of congregations in clusters, and something may come out of that. We don't want to revive and renew presbytery, so we have to go to business meetings. But I happen to be scholar in residence at a Baptist congregation across the river from where I live in Niagara Falls. And there are 5 congregations in Niagara Falls, New York, that belong to the American Baptist Church. It's a denomination. They don't have business meetings, but every time one of them has some special event, the others all come. That's how the clustering works. And so I just throw that out there. There may be something during this wind up each day. I'm going to give you an illustration of one of the clusters. The one that I'll use today is in Essex County. It's surrounding Windsor, Ontario. They're planning a service, and they got so many in the cluster that they're having to meet at the nearby United Church camp. And it will be a worship service outdoors in the chapel at the camp. But they are hoping for 500 or 1,000 people. The former moderator, David Giuliano, is their preacher on that occasion, and they have already just under 100 in their joint choir and musicians. They have 80 already singers. They have a bunch of musicians. Probably will have 100 in the joint choir at the campsite. It'll be on June 1st, which is when most of the clusters are gathering. We're anxious to have more information about the Gower service. It's being live streamed across the country through the afternoon, as it turns out, because of time zones. But we had a cluster getting organized in St. John's, Newfoundland, but we've decided to disband it and send them to the national service so that we'll have a good congregation there at Gower Street when that happens. It was actually Cheryl-Ann kind of persuaded us to do that as well, I should say. So anyway, somebody asked me the other day, who are the Friends of the Foundation group? It's an odd name. Mostly people from Woodlake, clients, authors, retirees from that organization, but also some people from Edge who began work with the Woodlake people earlier on. And we got some advice from the United Church of Canada Foundation. And so part of the program is fundraising. Oh, yes. Come back to what Royal asked about people giving offerings or whatever if they're online. Toward the end of this series, we're going to have Royal himself and John Bedell, who's our host every day. He's down in the bottom right corner. John Bedell, we're going to put them on the panel, and I'm going to interview them about those hard questions of how we manage with congregations who are not in the sanctuary and so on. But I want to tell you this. I have adult grandchildren living in Toronto, but whose membership is at our congregation here in Niagara Falls. And they're saying to me, why doesn't the United Church, when the person is announcing the offering, why is there not one of those things on the screen? You focus on it with your camera. John, what do you call that?
A Q code.
QR code. It's a QR code.
Yeah, that's, at my age, I forget some of these things. All right, the QR codes. And so there's the suggestion, and you guys are going to be asked these questions, the two of you. How can we make it work? Because you are experts in media, both of you. And so we're going to get back to you on that. So I'll skip ahead now just to begin to wind things up. But since we're using the Untied Church as kind of a background book for this series, I was prepared for some pushback on some things in chapter 1 that were barely touched on, but actually Cheryl-Ann handled everything so well. I just want to say that I've had some pushback on the suggestion in chapter 1 that ministers are not under so much pressure these days, not under abuse or bullying or whatever by people in their congregations. I didn't express that properly because in the recent issue of the Broadview magazine, it is suggested that one of the biggest issues of last year, in fact, they put it at number 1, was the abuse of clergy. And this is the opposite of the concern about clericalism. There are a lot of, and the United Church has a long history of, it used to be in the old manual, the dreaded 363 trial of clergy. If you could get 5 people in a congregation to say that the ministry is ineffective, ministers went on trial, and the United Church almost the opposite of what the Catholic Church does to protect their clergy. The United Church tended to protect the poor victims of the clergy, and so we have a history of that. And the magazine, the Broadview magazine, said it's a growing problem. I had said the opposite in chapter 1, and I stay by that, because while there are still people in the congregation that are bullying some of their ministers, especially many of the women, who are now a majority among our ministers, in spite of that, the church itself has managed to move away from putting every minister in trouble on trial to mediating and resolving and not having ministers dismissed. Many of those, part of the reason the change is that many ministers began to take the church to court, and the church and the ministers tended to win in big figure settlements against the church when they were put on trial and their ministries or their livelihoods ruined and so on. The public courts tended to take the opposite view of the church. I'm babbling on, so I don't want to have too much on there, but another thing that I put in chapter 1 is that the other myth is that there are not enough ministers. There are some shortages. We know that. However, and I'm not denigrating the importance of the ordained ministry, but God knows what she's doing in licensed lay worship leaders, designated lay ministers, along with the ordained ministry. I think something very significant in the life and ministry of the church is happening, again, organically and growing up from the bottom. And I believe it's very appropriate, and I believe that, as I say, God knows what she's doing. The other big change in ministry, of course, is that the largest number of ministers, slight majority, are women. So there are things that I don't mind acknowledging that I expressed not as well as might be done in the book, but I'm delighted with the way people are handling it and studying it. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking Royal Orr. Not everybody knows that he's a kind of a superstar. Well, almost of yesteryear. That's not a good way to say it, but nevertheless, there we go. Royal Orr was, I think, for 10 years, the host on the CBC of Cross Country Checkup. Was it 10 years, Royal?
No, it was 10 years with Spirit Connection at the United
Oh,
Church.
yeah, that was the next one. After the CBC, he went to Vision TV and did the Spirit Connection and so on. So it's great to have him hosting this whole series, and I want to acknowledge him, and we're going to put him on the hot seat later on as well on some questions. So we also want to thank the very Reverend Richard Bott. Very great honor to have him on today, and Cheryl-Ann Stadlebauer-Sampa knows what's going on and shared it with us as well. I want to thank our technician, John Bedell. He's among the friends of the foundation group, and in a kind of a way, so is Cheryl-Ann. She's met with us and so on. So we're happy to have all of them today, and we're very grateful for their participation. Next week, we have an Indigenous minister, Kimberly Roy, minister of Goodfish Lake United Church in Alberta, and she'll be helping us to understand the connection between Indigenous traditional spirituality and Indigenous church life. How are these connected? obviously in Christ, but she'll be helping us with that, and we'll see reflections of that in our June events as well. We're all leading in that direction, and along with Kimberly Roy next week. We'll have a pre-recorded piece from David Giuliano, again focused on Christ, because we're not just celebrating the church, we're celebrating Christ. So we look forward to the dialogue with them, and Royal will be in the chair, and we'll see you all then.